Good afternoon, readers of Global Research, Lux Media. We are at the crossroads of a very serious crisis. Two active theater wars in Ukraine on the one hand, and of course in the Middle East. And then we have a new president of the United States, which has a rather unusual discourse of hinting that he might invade Canada if we don't accept to become the 51st state of the United States of America. There is, in fact, an underlying concept of the United States corresponding to Trump's statements of privatizing countries. Now, he also wants to privatize Greenland, or at least to buy Greenland, and there are various other issues which point in that direction. Our focus today will essentially be on the Middle East and the recent developments regarding the war on Syria. And I must say that, in fact, the underlying objective is ultimately to extend US hegemony in northern Syria, essentially Kurdistan. Well, Kurdistan exists as a province within Iraq, but there's a whole section of northern Syria which will eventually be entitled Kurdistan. At least that's what it seems to be unfolding. And this area now is also chosen for the establishment of a new military base, not the previous one, which is already there, but a new military base, and a rather extensive part of Syria would be under US jurisdiction control. And then you have Turkey with minor gains up in northern Syria, essentially the regions which are north of Aleppo would be annexed to Turkey. But at the same time, this is not exactly in the context of Turkey's broader agenda, which is to revive the Ottoman Republic, so to speak. Today we have in the studio expert on war making, but also of course he is very much in the peacemaking process, and the whole geopolitics seems extremely confused at the moment. How do you view this, Drago? Specifically, on the one hand, the new administration of Donald Trump and his various statements, but also the repercussions that this has on the war theater in the Middle East and the system of alliances.
Thank you very much for the question. It's always a pleasure to be here and to talk to you specifically. So first, I think it's important to understand how Trump sees the U.S. The current administration and the so-called deep state see the U.S. as a sort of an empire with a number of client states which are not essentially directly controlled by the United States. On the other hand, Trump is some sort of a nationalist, and he essentially sees the U.S. as a country that needs to expand physically and essentially take over certain countries, which is why he's talking about annexing Canada and Greenland and retaking the Panama Canal, as he says. So in that regard, he might actually find common ground with a country like Turkey, or it seems that he might do so. However, the U.S. and the U.S. system doesn't really tolerate sovereign countries. And even if a country wants to be 80% compliant with U.S. policies and 20% sovereign, that's a no-go for the political elites in the United States. And this is a problem with Turkey. Turkey has been largely aligned with the U.S. and NATO interests in most of the regions it's engaged in. So that includes the South Caucasus, Central Asia, Ukraine, Syria. However, there is a portion of Turkish politics and foreign policy that the U.S. doesn't tolerate, and of course that's the issue with that the U.S. has with Erdogan, and this is the reason why they tried to topple him, and this backfired in many ways. First of all, the U.S. lost control over the Turkish military for the first time since the 1950s, when Turkey joined NATO, not 1952, if I'm not mistaken. So ever since 1952, the U.S. was able, and the Pentagon specifically, was able to use the Turkish military to launch coups against non-compliant governments. And this failed for the first time in 2016 when Erdogan dodged the bullet, so to speak, maybe even literally in some way. So what Erdogan has been doing ever since, he essentially purged the Turkish military of American influence, which is why Turkey lost much of its officer corps. And these people were essentially replaced by not just by people who are loyal to Erdogan, because there was not enough officers. This actually brought about the rise of Turkish drones and Turkish unmanned warfare systems, which explains their success in various theaters up until Ukraine, at least, where it met its match in the Russian military. So what really is going on is we see that Turkey and the U.S. are still coordinating their actions in the Middle East, and this, of course, includes Israel. We see a lot of anti-Israeli rhetoric coming from Erdogan, but the reality on the ground doesn't match with that. Turkey has been exporting various important commodities to Israel, which are crucial to the functioning of the Israeli economy and the society itself, which, again, as I said, it doesn't match the rhetoric, the harsh rhetoric that Erdogan is, using, especially against Netanyahu and his policies in Gaza, which are essentially a bunch of atrocities against the Palestinian people. So we see the same in Syria. The so-called Syrian civil war, which is actually just starting right now. Before that, it was the invasion of Syria, led by the U.S., NATO, Israel, and Turkey, obviously. So at the moment, or at least up until the fall of the Assad government, the U.S., Turkey, and Israel were on the same page. They just wanted to remove Syria as a sovereign nation and then take away whatever they wanted from the country, particularly its natural resources. For the Israelis, this meant the control of the water sources in the southwest of the country. For the Turks, it meant the control over the north, particularly the northwest of the country. And for the U.S., it meant the control of oil wells and oil industry in the east and the south, in the northeast of the country. And this is where the Kurds come in. The Kurds were essentially the infantry of the U.S. Air Force in that area, and they're still there. So we have a very complex situation now. We have Turkish, U.S., and Israeli-backed forces that control Syria, and we have the Kurds who are also U.S.-backed, and in some cases they're fighting each other. So you have U.S.-backed forces fighting U.S.-backed forces in the northeast. And of course, there's Turkey. Turkey wants to eliminate any sort of Kurdish entity on its borders, particularly in the south, or in this case, in the north of Syria, because this area is very, very sensitive for the Turks. they have a massive Kurdish minority. Around 25% of the population of Turkey are Kurds. They mostly live in the southeast of the country, and this is the area that borders northern Syria, specifically the area that's controlled by the Kurdish-led SDF. And of course, there's the Iraqi Kurdistan, which is barely touches this area. There's a small section of the border that would allow for some sort of territorial continuity in case that any Kurdish entity were to formalize in this area. And of course, this Kurdish entity, if it ever becomes independent in some way, it would simply push into Turkey, because the largest number of Kurds still live in Turkey. There's a massive Kurdish population in Iraq, in the Iraqi Kurdistan area specifically, and of course there's a smaller population in Syria, but it's politically and geopolitically important because this area is controlled by the Kurdish-led SDF. So in that regard, the Turks, they want to make sure that they can control these two entities, or at least that they can dismantle them in some way to ensure that they cannot form any sort of a front against Turkey in its southeastern part, which is of course strategically important for Turkey itself.
Well, I mean, what you describe is a very complex system of alliances, because Israel is allied with Kurdistan. Turkey is allied with Israel, although that's not official, but at the level of weapons systems, they have joint production. So that really puts them as allies with Israel from the military standpoint. And of course, Erdogan has a personal relationship even with Netanyahu. So it's very, of course, they will say, well, against the genocide, but in fact, they're also complicit in the genocide because they're providing weapons to Israel. But now when I look at this map, it looks very contradictory, because first of all, and it's much more complex than World War One. The Triple Entente, Triple Alliance. You have Turkey, which is allied with Russia, okay, and together they control the Black Sea. Now, you're not able to wage a war against Iran in those conditions, because Turkey is also allied with Iran. Okay, Turkey is allied with Iran, Turkey is allied with Israel, and Turkey is allied with Russia. Now that sounds very unstable, and they also control the access to the Mediterranean, based on the protocol, which was reached, if I remember correctly. Well, it was reached in Switzerland. But then you have a situation where literally the United States is at odds to extend this war into Iran. And I mean, that's, in a sense, that's positive. But given the structure of alliances, they cannot wage a conventional war on Iran. They might be able to wage a nuclear war on Iran, particularly if you have idiotic members in the State Department that thinks that nuclear wars are harmless to civilians because the explosion is underground, and then you can go ahead with what is called a mini nukes and so on and so forth. That would lead to World War III. Any kind of action in that regard would lead to World War III, but the United States doesn't have the possibility of waging a conventional war without the support of Turkey against Iran. And Iran is also allied with Russia. And consequently, another thing which is very significant, the United States has one of the largest Air Force facilities in the Middle East, which is located in Qatar. I've been close to that military base. It's enormous. Okay. Now, anybody who understands a bit of geopolitics will come to the conclusion you can't have your largest, and it's also, that base is also considered to be the regional facility for Central Command headquarters. Well, Central Command headquarters is in the United States, but that base is the largest in the Middle East. I'm talking about air base, and it is in a country which is allied with Iran. Everybody knows that. Iran and Qatar produce natural gas. They have joint partnership. And in other words, anybody who has a minimal understanding of strategic geopolitics said we can't really wage a war against Iran from enemy territory. Now, I'm perhaps exaggerating, but I've been to Qatar on several occasions. People there say Iran is our best friend. That is a consensus, and they're there. They're business people. They don't have any military facilities, but Turkey has military facilities also in Qatar. So that we're in a very complex situation and a very dangerous situation, because any kind of action which is taken on the spur of the moment, or maybe what's Trump? He says, "What do I do?" Well, he'll take his thing and then press on Siri. Siri, what do I do? Okay, people know about that, but in effect, that's not the way it happens. You have a vast data bank and computers and so on, which are located in Strategic Command Headquarters, Central Command Headquarters, Israel, and so on, NATO and Brussels. And any kind of stupid action could lead into World War III. And that is why we have to be very cautious, and we have to have an understanding. And unfortunately, the peace movement doesn't have that understanding. With all due respects, why? Because these things are not necessarily reported on mainstream media, and of course, independent media is censored, including this program. So there we are. Now, Drago has a very detailed understanding of the dangers of nuclear war. And I think that is something we're returning to in a sense, that if ever Israel would act in terms of a nuclear attack, and incidentally, they have already about 200 nuclear weapons which are intended to attack Iran. But if we enter into that particular context, that's World War III, and it's the destruction of humanity. I mean, people who have an understanding of the impacts of nuclear weapons know that. Drago is one of them, and he tell us what a nuclear explosion out of Israel would result in, because there have been recently reports which we would consider as fake news, which said that Israel dropped a nuclear bomb close to where the Russians had their naval base. That's absolute nonsense. And we know, because we know what the understanding of a nuclear bomb is, but we have to look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki and all the studies which have been done. Drago, how would you?
I agree. I agree with what you said. I mean, it's the first sign of a nuclear explosion, of course, is a spike in radiation, and a simple Geiger counter would detect that. And for that reason, we know that the explosion that happened in the former naval base in Tartus wasn't a nuclear one. And of course, the Israeli military has launched hundreds of these attacks on ammo depots and all these other areas where the former Syrian Arab army had weapons stored and all these other weapon systems. And of course, for the Israelis, this was very important because this is a way to essentially de-sovereignize Syria. So even if there is any kind of a resistance that might retake the country from these terrorists, from these ISIS terrorists who were, rebranded as the HTS or the opposition or whatever, if they were removed, by the resistance of the Syrian people would still have a problem because the military structure that was ensuring Syria's sovereignty is now gone. And of course, this is where all these explosions are coming from. And some of them were so massive that it created some sort of a fake news environment where people believed that there was an actual nuclear explosion. Of course, I advise people to look at the video of the explosion. That thing is nothing in comparison to a nuclear weapon. Even a small tactical nuclear weapon absolutely dwarfs what we saw in Tartus, and that was thousands of kilograms of explosives detonating at once. So the scale of the destruction, minus the radiation, the radioactive fallout is a whole other issue we can talk about. But the sheer magnitude of the destruction of nuclear weapons is such that you have the shock wave, and you also have the thermal the thermal momentum of the explosion. So those two things combined create an enormous destructive power that is unmatched by conventional explosives. And of course, Israel has a ballistic missile, specifically Jericho-3, which can reach Iran, and the U.S. also has submarines and F-35 fighter jets armed with B-61 variable yield nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs, and these weapons would be the first used against Iran, because as you pointed out, a conventional war against Iran in these conditions is not possible. So in 2003, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, it had hundreds of thousands of soldiers ready to go in and take over a country, and at the time, Iran didn't have such a large and powerful ballistic missile arsenal. Now this has changed. The U.S. has much less soldiers to spare for such an invasion than was the case 20 years ago, and Iran has a much bigger arsenal of weapons. So what that means is that the concentration of conventional U.S. military power anywhere close to Iran would be subjected to a large-scale, long-range attack by Iran, or a retaliatory or preemptive attack by the Iranians. And this includes military bases in countries like Qatar, like the UAE, let's say potentially Iraq or Saudi Arabia. So that means a conventional invasion is out of the question. It's not possible. Even if Turkey supported it, it would still be extremely difficult to pull off. So this leaves the U.S. with a nuclear option, and this is the real danger. This is what can destabilize that region and, in turn, the entire world, as you said. And for people who think that World War III is not possible coming from the Middle East, think again, because a country like Iran is a gateway towards areas which are not the Middle East. Specifically, we're talking about South Asia, we're talking about Central Asia, we're talking about the Caucasus, and we're talking about Turkey, of course. So in that regard, for a country like Russia or even China, the destabilization or even the destruction of Iran, they know this would bring about the chaos which would spill over into Central Asia. And now we're getting behind Russia's and China's back. So for Russia, this is its southern soft underbelly. For China, this is its western border, which is largely dormant. There's the Xinjiang region where there are Uyghurs who are also being exploited by the US and NATO to destabilize China. And this has been the case for decades. The Chinese have been fighting this NATO-backed terrorism in Xinjiang for decades. And they've been trying to eradicate it through various means. The mainstream propaganda machine likes to call this the so-called Uyghur genocide, which, to be honest, is nothing more than an actual conspiracy theory. I haven't actually seen any evidence about the so-called genocide. What the Chinese have been doing, they've been using various tools to eradicate terrorism by using non-military means. And for the Chinese, this is very important. However, if there is a radicalization or a destabilization of Central Asia, then the threat becomes real because there could be cross-border attacks, there could be all sorts of things. And for this reason alone, no multipolar power is going to allow the destruction of Iran, which is now a member of both the SCO, which is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and BRICS. So there are two reasons for why the multipolar world would not allow the destabilization or the destruction of Iran. Of course, Turkey is a very important country in that regard because Turkey borders Iran. And as you mentioned, there are various important military installations of NATO in that area, including the Incirlik base where nuclear weapons of the US are located. And these weapons, because they're under the control of the United States, they would be used against Iran. So that would make Turkey complicit in any attack on Iran. And of course, it would drag Turkey into a war with a country that the Turkish people, I'm pretty sure they don't want to go to war with Iran because they have a very long history. They have cultural and religious connections that simply make such a prospect untenable and simply not logical for them.
Well, what you describe is certainly not that, well, it's not very optimistic, unless, of course, you give a crash course to the incoming president of the United States. Do you think that, I mean, you should be his nuclear, I'm joking, arms advisor? Now, do you think that he has the knowledge that you and of what you have just described? Does he know what a nuclear weapon is going to do? I've seen the quotations of Hillary Clinton. I haven't seen any specific statements, correct me if I'm wrong, regarding Trump's understanding of nuclear weapons. But I suspect it's probably rather superficial. Because politically,
I would say so. Yeah, I'm just saying I agree with you. I think Trump's understanding of many things besides the things that he was dealing with, which is real estate and finances and so on, I doubt that he understands military technologies and geopolitics enough to understand the impact of these things. And I remember, I was reporting about his statements during his first presidency when he was trying to understand what hypersonic weapons are. So he couldn't understand the concept of something going faster than the speed of sound. So he would mix it up with the speed of light and so on, which means that he doesn't really understand how weapons function. And many of these complex weapons are really difficult to understand unless you are really dealing with this almost on a daily basis. However, in his defense, he did talk about the dangers of nuclear war with Kim Jong-un. And this is something that could give us a hope. because he understands that a counterattack from North Korea would devastate at least a dozen American cities, major American cities. So we're talking about millions or tens of millions of dead Americans who would die because of the recklessness of the administration and the U.S. military. So this is why he said he wants good relations, or at least a working relations with North Korea. So we could say that this also affects Iran. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, so Trump might be more encouraged to be more aggressive towards Iran. But he was also more aggressive towards North Korea until North Korea acquired ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, which can reach America. So essentially what could happen is we could see a nuclear-armed Iran very soon, if in several months or in years. I'm not sure, on the timeline. Of course, that depends on how fast they can build nuclear warheads. So that means that if Iran becomes a nuclear power, Trump will be deterred. He will not try to go into a war with a country that has nuclear weapons, or at least any sort of weapons of mass destruction.
That's assuming that he listens to your advice, because it's not clear. They don't have time to start doing the research. And his appointee, with all due respect, his appointee to the Pentagon is incompetent, because the only thing he's interested is theology and religion and so on. And I think it's a big mistake now to consider even that this is a Zionist, that we're favoring Zionism, or we're coming to the rescue of the state of Israel and so on and so forth. That's absolute nonsense. But there's a lot of people even who are in the peace movement who firmly believe that this is the Greater Israel Project. It's not a Greater Israel Project. It's a foreign policy project of the United States of America, which is an imperialist power. Now, what we have to do, we have to educate the decision makers, okay? Okay, Trump is a good guy, but let's educate the decision makers. Let them know what's going to happen, okay? Secondly, we need to extend the message to the broad resistance movement. In other words, the anti-war movement. That is not an easy task either, because segments of this anti-war movement are funded by philanthropic foundations, okay? And the other dimension, which I think is very important, is the fact that the United States is at war, but at the moment I would describe it as an economic war against the People's Republic of China. And that in turn, first of all, that is devastating, because if you look at the US economy, a large percentage of what people consume on a daily basis comes from the People's Republic of China. And it's getting into more and more advanced areas of production, including artificial intelligence, computers, automobiles, and so on. Now, if you start putting taxation against the People's Republic of China as a means to, in other words, because they're allies with Russia and they've taken a stance on against war, well, you're in a big mess. And I think that Trump should understand, with regard to Korea, that if there is any kind of attack directed against North Korea, this would encompass the entire Korean peninsula, because the distance from Seoul to the Korean border is like going from Manhattan to New Jersey. Okay, well, that's these are the points of geography that the incoming president is familiar with. So that is the message that we want to spread: peace on earth, which essentially means dismantling an imperial project. And dismantling dismantling an imperial project without necessarily threatening the future of humanity. And that requires, of course, it requires diplomacy, but it also requires understanding of basic concepts, and it requires a certain honesty in politics, which we don't have, because all these governments are corrupt and they only think of making money. And then you have Bill Gates, who says, "Oh, we have to have a vaccine to now, which will help us survive, etc., etc." All of this is part of a very broad agenda, and I think we must also understand that the vaccine is part of this project, because it does result in mortality, and everybody knows now that this vaccine has an effect on excess mortality. I'm not saying that it is an instrument of warfare, but it also generates economic and social disruptions, and all of this creates chaos. And then again, artificial intelligence is there, and maybe artificial intelligence is not so stupid in relation to our politicians. So I think we've covered. You have the last word, Drago.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned so many things, and I agree. Actually, I would argue that all those things you mentioned are actually an instrument of warfare, and of course, warfare isn't always kinetic. It can also be led in different ways that don't seem like it's war, but in effect, it is. It has the same or similar effect as actual warfare. In that regard, I think it's important for sovereigntist movements to spring up and across the planet, where people would understand that the empire or the imperial entity, whatever you want to call it, doesn't want anything good for you. And this includes countries like Israel, because Israel is going to be the first country to be targeted by the Iranians if Iran is attacked by the U.S. or the U.S.-led coalition. And even without nuclear weapons, Israel could be devastated by such attacks. So the point is, nobody has an interest in escalation, or at least normal people, regular people, don't have any interest to see any sort of escalation. So what we could do is we could connect around the world, and not just through peace movement, but also like on a diplomatic level, as you said, and try to maintain peace, because it's in the best interest of us all. Only the small minority of verifiably insane people who want nuclear war or any sort of war, they're the only ones who gain something from this. And of course, this is power or unlimited power, as they believe. The rest of us are losers in such a scenario. But so that means that we should be motivated to connect on a global level and try to prevent such events, because it's going to be a disaster for all of us.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Drago, and thank you to Lux Media for hosting this debate. And our thoughts are with the future of humanity, truth in media, because when the lie becomes the truth, we can't move backwards. We have to focus on the truth, and that includes understanding of many different aspects in a very complex environment. And my suggestion to Donald Trump, ask Drago to explain the impacts. I'm serious. Ask Drago to explain the impacts of nuclear war, so that you don't make any stupid mistakes asking your Pentagon advisors to brief you, not to mention the CIA. But let's be respectful. And the CIA has to be democratized as well. Thank you very much, dear friends. This is Global Research. with the support of Lux Media. And thank you, Drago Bosnic, who has recently received the prize of the Mexican Club of Journalists.
Thank you very much.